Hey, so big spoiler for God of War 2018 in this video. I know that game released 3 years ago, but if you still haven't played it and want to remain unspoiled, probably should avoid watching this video. Thank you. God of War Ragnarok will conclude the God of War series Norse mythology saga, and this is a good thing. While some fans of Sony Santa Monica's beloved action series might be miffed that the franchise's dalliance into Norse mythology will conclude after just 2 games, the idea that Kratos' and Atreus' story won't overstay its welcome is a net positive. After all, AAA video game development times have extended longer and longer, many averaging 5 years worth of development time, and if the God of War reboot's venture into Norse mythology were to be a trilogy rather than a 2-game story, then this series might not be over for another decade. Big games like this just take a long time to develop. God of War franchise big shot Cory Barlog, no relation, highlighted lengthy development time as to why he wanted to end the franchise's Norse-inspired adventures after just 2 games. When speaking with God of War YouTuber Kaptain Kuba, Barlog, alongside God of War Ragnarok director Eric Williams, laid out the rationale describing why Sony Santa Monica wanted to avoid making this a trilogy. To quote, "There are several reasons, but I think one of the most important reasons is time. The first game took 5 years. I don't know how long it's going to take to finish the second game, but I'm just going to throw out that it's going to take close to a similar time to do this. Then if you think, wow, a third one in that same time frame, and we are talking like a span of close to 15 years of a single story. I feel like that's just too stretched out. I feel like we are asking too much to say the actual completion of that story. It just feels too long." Given where the team was at and where Eric was at what he wanted to do, I was like, look, I think we can actually do this in the second try. Most of what we were trying to do from the beginning was to tell a story about Kratos and Atreus. The core of the story's engine is really the relationship between these two characters, and the complexity radiates out like ripples in a pond. We could make it an ocean and have those ripples just go for thousands of miles, but is that necessary and is that beneficial, or are we feeling like, you know what, it's just spreading it too far apart. The ripples get too far apart and you lose the plot a little bit. End quote. This is a great decision for a couple of reasons. Most notably, it means that we will see the conclusion to the God of War Norse mythology setting sooner rather than later. As stated before, game development is becoming a longer and longer grind. Where a trilogy of games like Mass Effect could all release within 5 years of each other just a decade ago, big AAA games take at least 5 years to develop nowadays. And honestly, Barlog is correct. 15 years is just a really long time to create one story, even one that is really good, especially in interactive and visual mediums. It is just a tough ask. Additionally, God of War Ragnarok being the finale of the Norse Saga is terrific from a gaming perspective as well. Mostly because, if anything, the game is going to be stacked with iconic Norse mythology characters, which is very much unlike the previous game, God of War 2018. See, as great as God of War 2018 is, you could tell that the developers were holding back when it came to portraying the heavy hitters in the Norse pantheon. Aside from Baldur, the player doesn't fight important characters like Odin, Tyr, or Thor, and we don't see Atreus actively become Loki yet, which means there will be a lot potentially happening in God of War Ragnarok in terms of narrative, gameplay, and its boss battles featuring incredibly noteworthy Norse gods and goddesses that were not present in the first game, or at least characters that were not as prominent. After all, with God of War Ragnarok concluding the Norse Saga, there is no reason to withhold important gods or goddesses for the sequels when there aren't going to be any more sequels, obviously. And because of this, God of War Ragnarok will be a more eventful game than its predecessor. It's going to have a lot more going on. Furthermore, this bevy of possible Norse gods to fight also has the potential to reflect the epic scale of the older God of War games, something that wasn't as present in the more emotionally mature and character-driven God of War 2018. While God of War 2018 is for sure an epic game in its own right, its narrative stakes regarding a grieving father and son trying to scatter the ashes of a deceased loved one were not as high as the older games where you overthrow the gods of Olympus. Sure, God of War 2018 is arguably the best God of War game, both in terms of its emotionally resonant story and stellar gameplay, but the old games do have it beat when it comes to their high stakes. Revolving around Kratos' desire to murder the gods of Olympus, the old games, particularly God God of War 2 and God of War 3 are steeped with famous Greek gods and Greek mythological iconography, using these gods, goddesses, and famous locations as the basis for enthralling action set pieces and awesome boss battles. And while for sure God of War 2018 still had loads of grandiose battles, layered boss fights, and stunning locales based on mythology, you could tell that the developers at Sony Santa Monica were withholding some characters and locales for the sequels, whereas God of War 2 and God of War 3 blitzed the player with nearly everything. Similarly, God of War Ragnarok can potentially feature this same sense of scale, seeing as we still need to see more of the Norse characters in this story, and Kratos did not traverse to famous realms like Asgard or Valhalla in the previous game. God of War Ragnarok has the potential to be explosive in the spectacle department. In fact, there are a lot of places that the story can take us and a lot of world-renowned mythological characters to fight, and due to this, God of War Ragnarok looks epic and can potentially raise the stakes further than any previous God of War game before it. The game is about Ragnarok after all, meaning that the creative possibilities in regards to combat encounters, enemies, boss battles, action set pieces, and narrative twists are endless. The world is indeed Sony Santa Monica's oyster here. With that being said, Sony Santa Monica appears to be avoiding a pitfall that plagued the original God of War trilogy. In fact, by foregoing a Norse Saga trilogy in favor of making 2 games, Sony Santa Monica is showcasing that they have learned from a mistake with its older God of War games. See, as good as God of War 2 and God of War 3 are, they more or less have the same plot where Kratos desires to murder Zeus. Sure, a lot of different things happen in these 2 games, but Kratos' motivation remains the same. He just wants to kill Zeus, and with God of War 2 and God of War 3, the plot of one game actually was stretched to 2 games here. And as awesome as those games are, the narrative didn't need to be 2 games. It could have just been 1. Thankfully though, Sony Santa Monica isn't making the same mistake with God of War Ragnarok. When it comes to God of War Ragnarok being the finale of the Norse Saga, Sony Santa Monica is actively preventing the story from being stretched out into a trilogy again like the classic God of War games, because honestly those games didn't necessarily need to be a trilogy, and if the words of Cory Barlog are to be believed, apparently the same can be said here with God of War Ragnarok. Using his words as evidence, the game doesn't need to have its plot stretched out into a trilogy. It doesn't necessitate holding back any of the Norse pantheon or locations for future installments. We don't need to wait another decade to see the ending of the Norse Saga, and ultimately, this is a win for everyone. See ya. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel. Ring the bell so that you're notified for whenever I release a new video. Also, please leave a comment telling me what you hope will be in God of War Ragnarok and what you think of the God of War series in general, especially the reboots. Additionally, please consider checking out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, especially my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.